The rifle was already leveled at her chest when Annie Hart took her third step onto Elias Talbot's porch. She did not stop walking. That was the part people in Ember Ridge would talk about later, in the saloon and at the general store and across fences while laundry dried in the high Colorado wind. They would say she was either the bravest woman who had ever drawn breath at 9,000 feet above sea level, or the most reckless fool the territory had ever produced. They would argue about which one for years. Annie did not stop walking because she had already made her decision before she left town that morning. She had made it in the dark, pre-dawn hours while the rest of Ember Ridge slept, and while her sister Della lay in a fever that could kill her inside of a week if something wasn't done. She had made it while staring at the ceiling of the one-room shack she rented behind the milliner's shop, counting the knots in the pine boards overhead, listening to Della's labored breathing and measuring it against her own fear. Fear lost. The man behind the rifle was enormous. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Elias Talbot, if they ever got close enough to notice anything at all, which almost no one in the county ever did. He stood in the shadow of his doorframe the way a mountain stands, as though the land itself had simply decided to take human form in this particular spot and had no intention of moving. His dark hair fell across his forehead in an unruly wave, and his jaw was covered in a beard that had not known scissors in what looked like months. His eyes, dark gray and absolutely unreadable, tracked her with the precision of a man who had spent years watching for threats and had learned to treat all approaching things as threats first and ask questions only if they survived long enough to answer them. "Stop there," he said. His voice was low and flat, carrying none of the greeting a person might expect. Annie Hart stopped, not because he told her to, but because she had reached the bottom step and it seemed reasonable to pause before climbing. She was 26 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she had walked 11 miles from Ember Ridge in boots that had started rubbing a blister on her left heel somewhere around mile 7. She was tired, and she was frightened, and she was not going to let him see either one of those things. "Mr. Talbot," she said, "my name is Annie Hart. I need your help." The rifle did not lower. "Go back to town," he said. "I would," Annie told him, keeping her voice as steady as the situation absolutely required. "Except that my sister is dying, and the only person in 4 counties who knows enough about herbs and mountain medicine to possibly save her is standing right in front of me with a gun pointed at my chest. So I am afraid that going back to town is not something I am willing to do at this particular moment." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. High up in the ponderosa pines that crowded close to his property, a woodpecker hammered at dead wood. The wind moved through the needles with a sound like distant water. Somewhere below, invisible in the ravine that dropped off the eastern edge of his land, a creek ran cold and fast with snowmelt. Then Elias Talbot did something that nobody in Ember Ridge would have believed if they had not seen it with their own eyes. He stepped aside. He lowered the rifle, and he stepped back from the doorframe, and he left the entrance to his cabin open, and he waited. It took Annie Hart 3 full seconds to understand what she was looking at. Then she climbed the steps, walked across the porch, and stepped through his door. 3 days later, sitting at his rough-hewn table with a cup of pine needle tea steaming between her hands while outside the first real spring storm of 1882 rattled the shutters, she would think back to that moment and understand that it was not really about Della at all. Or rather, it was about Della, but it was also the first moment of something much larger, something that had no name yet and would take months to grow into the shape of what it actually was. But that morning she did not think about any of that. She thought about her sister, and she thought about the long walk back to town with whatever help she could carry, and she thought about the man who had stepped aside. She did not yet think about what it meant that he had. To understand how Annie Hart came to be standing on the porch of the most feared and avoided man in Routt County, Colorado in the spring of 1882, it is necessary to go back approximately 6 weeks, to the afternoon she arrived in Ember Ridge on the stage from Denver. She had not come looking for a new life in the romantic sense that dime novels like to describe. She had come because Della had written her a letter in January saying that she was well, that she had married a decent man named Hector Flynn, who ran a small cattle operation north of town, and that there was good work to be had at the schoolhouse for someone with Annie's education. The letter had sounded fine. Then in February another letter arrived, this one written by a woman named Mrs. Carol Prout, who ran the rooming house where Della had been staying since Hector Flynn had died in October of a horse-related accident that the letter was diplomatically vague about. Mrs. Prout wrote to say that Della was not well, that she had been coughing since the worst of the winter cold, and that it might do the girl good to have family near. Annie had sold nearly everything she owned to buy the stage fare from St. Louis, where she had been working as a seamstress and schoolteacher's aide for the past 4 years. She arrived in Ember Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, which in the Colorado high country meant that winter was still very much in charge, and spring was only a theoretical concept that someone had suggested as a possibility for some unspecified future date. Della was worse than the letter had suggested. Not consumption, the traveling doctor who passed through Ember Ridge every few weeks had said, but something in the lungs that he gave a Latin name Annie could not retain and described as inflammatory and persistent. He had left powders that cost more than Annie could comfortably afford and produced results that were, at best, modest. The town had opinions about everything, as small towns in the West reliably did. "There's a man up on the mountain," said Tom Greaves, who ran the livery stable and seemed to know everyone's business as a professional matter. He was a round-faced, good-natured man of 50 who wore the same battered hat every single day and had an opinion ready on any subject before you finished the sentence. "Goes by Talbot, Elias Talbot. Used to be a field surgeon in the war, they say, or something like it. Knows plants, knows remedies, knows things about sickness that regular doctors don't bother with." "Could I speak with him?" Annie asked. Tom Greaves looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he looked at 2 other men nearby, and they exchanged a look she understood perfectly, which was the look men exchange when they have all collectively decided that something is not worth discussing directly. "He doesn't come to town," Tom said carefully. "Then I could go to him." Another exchange of looks. "Annie," said Mrs. Prout, who had joined them by this point and who had taken a proprietary interest in Annie's well-being that was warm and slightly suffocating in equal measure, "nobody goes up to Elias Talbot's place. He doesn't allow it. He has made that quite plain." "How has he made it plain?" Annie asked. "He shot at the last 3 men who rode up that trail," said a lean, sun-weathered man named Pete Driscoll, who ran the general store and overheard everything that happened in Ember Ridge, as a natural consequence of being the person everyone had to talk to in order to obtain food and supplies. "Didn't hit any of them, but that's either because he's a poor shot or because he was making a point. Either way, the point was made." "What did those men want?" "2 of them wanted to buy his land," Pete said. "The third one was a sheriff's deputy, and what he wanted is not something I'm at liberty to say, but the general shape of it is that someone in the county seat had questions they thought Talbot should answer." "What kind of questions?" The look passed around the group again, that communal male glance that was equal parts discretion and cowardice. "There are stories," Mrs. Prout said, in the tone of someone closing a topic, "and I do not think all of them can possibly be true, but the general understanding in this town is that Elias Talbot keeps to himself for reasons that are not entirely innocent, and that a woman on her own would be wise to avoid him." "What are the stories?" Annie pressed. What she extracted over the following weeks, through a combination of direct questions and the overheard conversations of people who forgot she was in earshot, amounted to this. Elias Talbot had arrived in Ember Ridge approximately 3 years ago, in the winter of 1879, and had purchased a tract of mountain land at the northern end of the county that nobody else wanted because it was steep and heavily forested, and the growing season at that altitude was approximately 45 minutes long. He had built his own cabin, cleared his own land, grown his own food, and had absolutely no interest in any relationship with any other human being in the county. He had, people said, a dark past. They used those exact words, a dark past, without being able to specify what the darkness consisted of, which Annie privately noted was the way people usually used the phrase when they had impressions but not facts. The dark past was said to involve the war. He was from Tennessee originally, or possibly Kentucky, depending on who you asked, and something that had happened after the war, and possibly something that had happened before it as well. He was said to be dangerous. He was said to be unstable. He was said to be the kind of man who had seen too much violence to be trusted around decent people. He was also, and Annie kept coming back to this detail, said to have saved the life of a Ute woman's child 2 winters ago when the child had been near death from a lung infection, and nobody else could do anything. He had apparently come down from the mountain of his own accord that one time, wordlessly done what needed doing with a collection of dried herbs and a poultice that smelled terrible and worked brilliantly, and then gone back up the mountain without accepting payment or even a civil conversation about the weather. Annie held that detail close. Della got worse through April. The powders ran out. The traveling doctor was reportedly stuck in Steamboat Springs dealing with a situation involving a mining accident and would not be through for another 3 weeks. Della lay in the back room of Mrs. Pruitt's rooming house and breathed like someone who was trying very hard to do something that should have been easy, and Annie sat beside her and held her hand and felt fear doing what fear does when it has nothing to work against, which is that it begins to eat the person from the inside. On the night of the 14th of April, Annie made her decision. She was going up the mountain. She left before first light, in the dark blue hour when the stars were still visible and the town was sleeping. She wore her warmest coat and her sturdiest boots, and carried a canvas bag with water and biscuits, and a clean cloth in case she needed to tend to any wound that might result from the visit. She had written a letter to Mrs. Pruitt explaining where she was going and left it on the kitchen table where it would be found at breakfast. She did not want to be talked out of it by people whose concern for her safety, while genuine, did not extend to having a solution to offer instead. The trail up to Talbot's property was not marked on any map, but Tom Greaves had drawn her a rough diagram on the back of an old bill of lading after extracting from her a promise that she would not tell anyone he had helped, and that if she died, he had no knowledge of any such diagram. The terms seemed reasonable. She folded the diagram into her coat pocket and set off north along the creek road as the stars began to fade. The walk took most of the morning. The trail climbed steadily through stands of aspen, and then into the darker, denser territory of the ponderosa pines, and the air thinned and cooled as she went up, and the distant sounds of town fell away behind her until there was nothing but wind and birds and her own footsteps and breathing. She had grown up in Ohio, in a flat place of wide fields and shallow rivers, and the mountains still struck her as slightly improbable, as if someone had taken the sky and folded it downward into a shape that seemed unnecessarily dramatic. She found them beautiful in the way that she found things beautiful that were also slightly threatening. She came out of the tree line into the small clearing where his cabin sat at roughly 10:30 in the morning, judging by the sun. He was already watching her from the porch. She understood later that he would have heard her long before she arrived, would have had time to prepare himself, to make his choice about what to do. The rifle had been in his hands when she emerged from the trees, and it stayed there while she crossed the clearing and climbed toward the porch, and she had made herself not look at it. She had looked at his face instead, because she had learned years ago that a person's face tells you more than their hands do. His face told her almost nothing, which in itself told her something. He was not angry. He was not afraid. He was watchful and still in a way that most people simply were not, with the economy of motion of someone who had learned that stillness was its own kind of armor. And then she told him about Della, and he stepped aside and she went in. The inside of his cabin was not what she expected. She had expected squalor, or at least the aggressive disorder of a man living completely alone without anyone to observe him. What she found was functional neatness. The neatness not of a fastidious person, but of someone who understood that in a small space with limited resources, disorder becomes expensive. There was a single main room with a stone fireplace, a rough table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and along the entire length of the north wall, shelving made from pine planks that held a collection of small clay pots and paper packets and glass jars and dried bunches of plants hanging from hooks, arranged with an order that suggested a system she did not yet understand. It smelled of cedar and something herbal and faintly of smoke and pine resin, and it smelled nothing like illness or neglect, which she had half expected. He set the rifle against the wall near the door and did not look at her while he moved to the shelving. She stood in the middle of the room and waited. "Tell me the symptoms," he said. His voice was different inside, less flat, or perhaps she was hearing it better without the open air to scatter it. He had a southern cadence under the words, something she had not been sure of on the porch. She told him everything she knew about Della's condition. He listened without interrupting, which was more than most men she knew managed. As she spoke, he moved along the shelving, taking down jars and packets, and setting them on the table with a deliberation that suggested he was making decisions as she talked. She watched his hands. They were large and scarred across the knuckles, and on the right forearm there was an old burn scar that ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow, healed smooth and shiny. The hands were, despite their size and their history, careful with the small containers. When she had finished describing Della's condition, he was quiet for a moment. "How long?" he said. "The cough started in January. It's been 6 weeks since it changed, since it got deep." He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and then he began separating things on the table into 2 piles. "This," he said, touching the first pile, "goes in water heated close to boiling, steeped for 10 minutes, strained. She drinks it twice a day. It tastes terrible. She drinks all of it." He moved his hand to the second pile. "This is a poultice. You mix it with a little lard or any kind of fat, spread it on cloth, apply it to her chest morning and night, keep it warm." He began packing the items into a cloth wrap, tying it with practiced efficiency. She watched him and tried to think of how to say the next thing she needed to say. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. He stopped tying and looked at her directly for the first time since she had entered the cabin. Up close, his eyes were not simply dark gray as she had thought. There was something complex in them, something that reminded her of a sky before weather changes. "Nothing," he said. "I can't take something for nothing," Annie told him. "You can," he said, and went back to tying the cloth. "Mr. Talbot, take it," he said. The word was not harsh, but it was final. She took it. She walked back down the mountain with the cloth package held carefully in both hands. And for most of the walk she thought about the way he had said take it, and about the shelving full of carefully tended plants, and about the way he had listened to her without once looking impatient or bored or condescending, which was a thing she had come to associate with men being addressed by women on medical topics. She thought about the burn scar and about the darkness people attributed to him with such comfortable vagueness. She thought about his eyes when he looked at her directly. She went home and gave Della the tea, and applied the poultice and held Della's hand through the rattling cough that the poultice initially provoked as the lungs loosened. And she told Della about her morning in the most neutral possible terms, which was that she had obtained remedies from a man on the mountain. Della, weak as she was, managed to look at Annie with the particular expression that younger sisters reserve for situations where they believe the older sister is hiding something. "A man on the mountain," Della repeated. "Yes," Annie said. "Tom Greaves said nobody goes up there. Tom Greaves drew me a map." Della coughed and then she smiled. "What was he like?" "He was helpful," Annie said. Della looked at her with that expression again. Annie pretended not to see it. Over the next week, Della improved. It was not a dramatic, overnight recovery of the kind that happened in stories. It was the slow, incremental kind, the kind where on Tuesday she kept the tea down without coughing for a full hour, and on Thursday she managed to sit up in bed and eat a bowl of Mrs. Prout's bean soup, and on Sunday she walked to the window and looked out at the muddy street and said that it was the finest muddy street she had ever seen in her life. And Annie sat down in the chair beside the window and put her hands over her face and did not cry precisely, but came very close. On Monday, Annie went back up the mountain. She told herself it was to report on Della's progress, which was true. She also told herself it was to return the cloth the remedies had been wrapped in, which was a reason she had manufactured, because it was small and concrete, and did not require her to examine the actual reason, which she was not yet ready to examine. She went in the morning, this time with sunlight already on the trail, and the aspens bright green with new leaves that trembled constantly in the mountain wind. She did not carry a letter of explanation for Mrs. Prout this time. She walked faster than she had the first time, knowing the trail now, and she came out into the clearing to find him around the side of the cabin splitting wood with the focused efficiency of someone who does physical labor not for exercise but because the wood is needed. He saw her. He set the axe down. She was, she realized, waiting for something, some question or accusation or demand to know why she had come back. What she got was nothing of the kind. He simply waited in the way he had waited on the porch, that quality of stillness that was not passive but somehow very much alive. "She's better," Annie said. "My sister, Della, the treatments are helping." Something moved in his face, too brief for her to name. "Good," he said. "I wanted to bring back the cloth." She held it out. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You walked 11 miles to return a piece of cloth," he said. "It's good cloth," Annie said. "It would be wasteful." He took the cloth. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the trees a jay made its rasping, argumentative declaration about something, and Annie thought that she should probably begin the walk back to town. "Do you want tea?" he said. She blinked. "I have tea," he added, as if clarifying a point of confusion, and then turned and walked back to the cabin as though he had not just said something that was, given everything she knew about him, approximately as surprising as if the mountain itself had offered her a beverage. She followed him in. It was pine needle tea, which she had never had before and which tasted the way clean air smells, sharp and resinous and cold even when it was hot. He made it efficiently, without fuss, heating water in a blackened kettle over the fire and steeping the needles and pouring it into 2 plain tin cups. He set one in front of her at the table and sat across from her with his own cup, and did not seem to be in any hurry for her to drink it and leave. "The poultice," she said. "How did you know what to use?" He looked at the table's surface for a moment, then at her. "There was a woman," he said, "Cherokee woman in Tennessee when I was a boy. She used to come to the farm where my family worked. She knew plants." He paused. "I paid attention. You learned it from her. And from other places." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "From the war, from years after." It was more than she had expected him to say. She waited in case there was more and did not try to push. There wasn't more, not yet, but she came back again the following week and the week after that. Each time she had a reason that was at least partially real. She had a question about the tea, which needed to be adjusted now that Della was improving. She had found a plant along the trail she did not recognize, and had pressed it between pages of her small journal and brought it to ask him what it was. She had baked bread, too much of it, and could not eat it all before it went stale, and it would be sensible to bring some to someone who lived this far from a bakery. He had accepted the bread without comment, and had looked at the pressed plant in her journal with an expression of what she was fairly certain was genuine interest. The conversations were not long, and they were not easy in the way that conversations between people who like each other are easy. They had a quality of careful excavation, each exchange like moving a little more earth, going a little deeper, not knowing what was under the next layer. She learned things, that his first name was Elias, which she already knew. that he had grown up in the Cumberland Mountains in eastern Tennessee, the son of a woman who cleaned houses for wealthy families and a father who appeared occasionally and reliably made things worse when he did. That he had been 17 when the war started and had made choices in those years that he had spent the subsequent 20 years calibrating the weight of. That he had come west because west was the direction that was still open, where a man with a past could put enough distance between what he had been and what he was trying to become. She did not learn the specific content of what he called the choices. Not yet. He learned things about her, too, because she had never been someone who withheld herself easily. That she was from Granville, Ohio, the daughter of a minister who had died when she was 18 and had left her and Della with a good education, some carefully maintained dignity, and very little else. That she had taught herself to sew, and had worked as a seamstress in St. Louis for 4 years while saving money and writing letters to Della in Colorado, and telling herself she was building towards something without being entirely certain what. That she had never been engaged, which was not for want of opportunity but for want of finding a man whose company she preferred to her own, which was a standard she privately considered reasonable and publicly considered nobody's business. He listened to all of this. He was, she discovered, an extraordinary listener. Not the performative listening of a man trying to seem interested, but the real kind, the kind that is almost tactile in its attentiveness. She came back and she came back, and somewhere in the 5th or 6th week of these visits, she stopped having reasons and started simply going. The people of Ember Ridge noticed. Mrs. Prout noticed with concern. Tom Greaves noticed with what looked like suppressed amusement. Pete Driscoll noticed and said something to 3 customers who each said something to 3 more people, which was how small-town information propagated in 1882 with the speed and coverage of wildfire. The result was that on a Wednesday morning in late May, while Annie was at the general store collecting supplies, she was approached by a man named Garrett Bowles. Garrett Bowles was something in Ember Ridge. He owned the saloon and had interests in several mining claims, and was physically impressive in the way of a man who had been strong in his youth, and had put on enough weight over the years since to suggest prosperity rather than indulgence. He was 42 years old, had been married once to a woman who had reportedly left him for reasons the town was carefully vague about, and had a smile that arrived on his face so regularly and so smoothly that it had stopped seeming like a response to anything and had become simply a feature, like a hat. "Miss Hart," he said, appearing at her elbow with that smile already in full deployment. "I hope the morning finds you well." "It does," Annie said, moving toward the flour barrel. "I couldn't help hearing," he said, and she noticed immediately the deliberateness of that phrase, which was the phrase of a man who had absolutely helped hearing and wanted her to know it while maintaining the fiction that he hadn't, "that you've been spending time up at Talbot's place." "I have been," Annie said. The smile remained. Something behind it did not. "I wonder if you understand the kind of man you're dealing with," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a register of concern, so practiced it sounded almost real. "There are things about Talbot's past that the town knows that perhaps a newcomer might not." "If you have specific information," Annie said pleasantly, "I would be happy to hear it." Garrett leaned slightly closer. "He killed a man," he said. "In Kansas back in '77. There was a warrant. That's why the deputy came up and why the deputy got shot at. That's the thing the county seat has been waiting to deal with for 3 years. Annie set down the scoop she had been using for the flour and looked at Garrett Bowles directly. She was very good at reading people, and what she read in Garrett Bowles's face was not civic concern. It was something else, something that was using civic concern as a suit of clothes. "How do you know this?" she asked. He seemed mildly surprised that this was her response. "People talk." "Who specifically?" The smile flickered. "Miss Hart, I'm trying to help you." "I appreciate that," Annie said, in the tone she used when she did not appreciate that. "I will keep what you've said in mind." She measured her flour, paid Pete Driscoll, and walked back to Mrs. Prout's with her bag over her arm and Garrett Bowles's information sitting in her mind like a stone she needed to examine in proper light. She sat with it all day. That evening she went to find Tom Greaves. Tom was a man who knew things. More importantly, Tom was a man who knew which things were true. She asked him about the warrant. Tom was quiet for longer than usual. He took off his battered hat and turned it in his hands, which was what he did when he was thinking carefully about something. "There was a man killed in Dodge City in '77, Tom said finally. "Yes, Talbot was there. The situation, from what I was able to piece together over the years, was that the man who died had been, well," he put his hat back on. "The man who died was not a good man. He had been hurting people, a woman in particular, in ways that the law in that county at that time was not inclined to do much about, and Talbot did something about it." Annie was quiet. "Warrant was issued," Tom continued, "because someone with money wanted it issued. Whether it would stand up in a proper court I genuinely don't know, but it's the reason he stays up on that mountain. If he comes to town regularly, sooner or later someone reports him to the county sheriff, and the county sheriff is obligated to act on a warrant regardless of the particular circumstances. So he's living in exile," Annie said. Tom looked at her carefully. "That is one way to put it." She walked back to Mrs. Prout's with this new shape of the story in her head and sat beside Della, who was well enough now to sit up in the evenings by the small window, and thought about it. The next morning she went up the mountain. She arrived to find him repairing the roof of his small outbuilding, moving with the careful balance of a large man who has learned to be precise. He saw her coming across the clearing and climbed down from the roof without hurry and waited for her. She did not bother with a reason for the visit. "Tell me about Kansas," she said. He went very still. It was a different kind of still than his usual stillness. His usual stillness was the watchful quiet of habit. This was something that happened in a single moment, a brief cessation like the held breath before a storm breaks. "Who told you?" he said. "More than one person. The version matters less than whether it's true." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the porch steps and sat down on the top step and leaned his forearms on his knees, looking out at the clearing rather than at her. She came and sat on the step below him at an angle so she could see his face and waited. "His name was Cal Rudd," Elias said at last. "He had a woman, a girl really, who worked in the establishment he ran. She was being hurt, badly and regularly. I knew her a little. I used to go in for a meal sometimes, and after a while I could see what was happening to her. I went to the city marshal. He told me it was a private matter and not his concern." He paused. "I went to Rudd directly to tell him it needed to stop. He was not receptive to that conversation." "What happened?" Annie asked. "He pulled a knife," Elias said. "It went badly for him." A long silence, the wind in the pines far below the creek. "And the girl?" Annie asked. Something shifted in his face, something close to relief, she thought, as if she had asked the question that mattered. "She left Dodge City. She went to her family in Missouri. I had a letter once from a friend who had seen her. She was teaching school." Annie sat with this for a moment. "And the warrant?" "Rudd had a partner with money and connections. The warrant was political." He glanced at her. "I'm not telling you I'm innocent. He died by my hand, but I am telling you what the situation was." "I know," Annie said. "Tom Greaves told me what he knew." Elias looked at her. "And Garrett Bowles told you his version." "Yes. Bowles and I have a history," Elias said. "He knows about the warrant and has used the threat of reporting me to the county sheriff as leverage at various times. He would like my land. He believes there is silver on it." He said this without heat, matter-of-factly, in the tone of someone describing weather patterns. Annie felt something cold move through her. "He told me about you to try to drive me away from you." Elias looked at her directly. "Is it working?" "No," Annie said. He held her gaze for a moment, and something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. It was brief and immediately composed again, but she caught it. It was the expression of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has almost stopped believing it will come. She looked away, because looking at it directly felt like an intrusion. She walked back to town that afternoon with her mind full and her heart doing something she was not quite ready to name. The summer came up around them, the way summer comes at high altitude, tentatively, with false starts and setbacks. A warm week, and then a late storm that coated the aspens in wet snow they shook off indignantly by afternoon. Della was well enough by June to walk to the end of the street and back, and by July she was talking about finding work at the schoolhouse in the fall, which was both good news about her health and a source of some complex emotion in Annie, who had oriented the past months around her sister's need, and was not entirely sure what she would orient herself around when that need was met. She knew, if she was honest with herself. She had known for a while. She went up the mountain twice a week now, and sometimes 3 times when Della was stable and the weather was good. The visits had changed in texture over the months. In the beginning they had been careful, each conversation a negotiation, both of them feeling for solid ground. Now they had the quality of something established, something that had found its shape. She could sit at his table and say nothing for a quarter of an hour and feel no pressure to fill the silence, which was a luxury she had not known she had been wanting until she had it. He had started teaching her things. Not formally, not the way a schoolteacher teaches, but in the way of someone sharing what they know because the other person is interested and present and capable. He taught her which plants were safe to use for what purposes and which ones were dangerous, how to identify them by leaf and stem, and the way they grew in relation to water and sunlight. He taught her how to read the mountain weather, which was essential knowledge at this altitude where a clear morning could produce a violent afternoon storm that had been invisible to someone who did not know what to look for. She brought him things in return. Books, mostly, from the small collection at Mrs. Pruitt's or borrowed from Pete Driscoll's wife who kept a lending library of sorts. She had quickly realized that he read voraciously, and with a range that surprised her, history and natural science and the occasional novel, anything that came within reach. The books became a regular part of the visits. She would bring one up and leave it, and on the next visit he would have read it and they would talk about it. And these conversations had the particular energy of 2 people who had found, unexpectedly, that their minds were well matched. One afternoon in early August, they were sitting outside on the porch steps because the day was warm and clear, and the view from his clearing across the valley below was the kind of view that seemed to require you to simply look at it without doing anything else. She was reading and he was doing something with a piece of wood and a small knife, the slow, patient work of carving that she had seen him do before. Without looking up from the wood, he said, "What do you do in the winters? You can't walk the trail in winter." She looked up from the book. It was not the question itself that caught her attention. It was the specific way it was asked, with a casualness that was not quite casual enough, that had the slightly over-controlled quality of a question someone has been working up to and is trying to make sound spontaneous. "I had not thought very far ahead about that," she said, which was both true and not entirely true. He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the wood. "I come down for supplies in October, before the first real snowfall. Pete Driscoll lays in my order." He paused. "I usually bring a pack horse." "That's practical," Annie said. "There's room," he said, and stopped. She waited. He set down the knife and the wood and looked out at the valley. "There's room in the cabin," he said, "if a person wanted to be up here in the winter, if that were something a person wanted." The air between them was very still. "Are you suggesting something specific?" Annie asked. He finally looked at her. His face was open in a way she had not seen it before, the watchfulness set aside in favor of something that was both more vulnerable and more direct. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that I have given a considerable amount of thought over the past several months to the difference between having you here and not having you here, and I find I strongly prefer the former." Annie Hart looked at Elias Talbot for a long moment. She looked at the scar on his arm and the careful way he held himself and the complex weather in his eyes, and she thought about all the things people in Ember Ridge had said about him and about the distance between those things and what she had found. "If I were to consider spending the winter on this mountain," she said slowly, "I would expect certain things to have been settled first." "Such as," he said. "Such as the matter of how you feel about me specifically," she said, "rather than the matter of winter accommodation generally." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the carving he had set down, turned it over in his hands once, and set it down again. Then he looked at her directly with the full weight of those storm-colored eyes. "Annie," he said, "I have been in love with you since the morning you walked across my clearing with a rifle pointed at your chest and didn't slow down." She drew a breath. "I did not know what to do with that," he continued, "because I am a man with complications that are not minor, and you are a woman who deserves a life without complications, and I have been trying for 5 months to be the kind of person who keeps his distance when keeping distance is the right thing to do." "And what changed?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "Nothing changed," he said. "I just ran out of convincing myself that keeping distance was what you actually wanted." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring the truth of it, and she found no trap and no hidden motive and no performance. What she found was a man who was genuinely frightened and genuinely honest, which was a combination she had not encountered before in precisely this configuration, and which she found, to her considerable personal surprise, to be the most compelling thing she had ever seen in another human being. "I have been in love with you," she said, "since you listened to me describe my sister's symptoms without once looking at the ceiling." He blinked. "That may sound like a small thing," she added. "It doesn't," he said. They sat on the steps in the warm August afternoon with the valley spread out below them in every shade of green and gold, and the thing that had been building between them for 5 months settled into the shape of what it actually was, and Annie thought that it felt less like an arrival than like finally being allowed to stop walking. He reached over and took her hand. His was large and scarred and warm. Hers was smaller and ink-stained from the letters she had been writing to her mother's old friends in Ohio. They sat with their hands together, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Garrett Bowles was not finished. She had understood from the beginning that he would not be. Men like Garrett Bowles did not accept the first clear signal that something was not available to them. They adjusted their approach and tried again with a different angle. And the different angle, when it came in mid-September, was one she had not fully anticipated. A man rode into Ember Ridge from Steamboat Springs carrying papers from the county seat, and the papers were a bench warrant for the arrest of one Elias Talbot on the charge of murder in Dodge City, Kansas, dated 1877. The man who rode in was not a deputy. He was something less official and more dangerous. The kind of person who operates in the territory between law enforcement and bounty hunting, a manhunter who had found a willing employer in the county seat and who had, according to Pete Driscoll, who had eyes and ears everywhere, been in contact with someone in Ember Ridge before he arrived, someone who had provided him with detailed information about Talbot's whereabouts. Garrett Bowles. The shape of it was clear as creek water. Annie learned about the manhunter on a Tuesday morning when Tom Greaves came to find her at Mrs. Pruitt's with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that told her the news before he opened his mouth. She sat very still while he told her, then she stood up. "How much time do I have?" she asked. "He arrived last night," Tom said. "He's at the saloon. He'll ride out when he's ready and he'll have help from what I can tell. Bowles has offered a premium to anyone willing to ride with him." "How many men?" 3 or 4, probably, she thought quickly. A group of armed men moving on horseback would reach Talbot's cabin in perhaps 2 hours on the trail. She could not take that trail on foot fast enough to beat them. But she knew things about that mountain now that men who had never been there did not know, including a shorter route through a saddle that Elias had showed her in July, a switchback trail that cut the distance by nearly a third, but was difficult to navigate without knowing exactly where to go. She went to the livery and saddled the horse she could not afford to rent and told Tom Greaves that she would pay him back, and Tom Greaves said that he had not seen her and she was not to mention the mare to anyone. She rode. The ride up the mountain on horseback was a different experience than walking it, faster and more terrifying in the places where the trail narrowed, and the drop-off appeared to the left, the valley floor far below through the trees. She took the switchback route and reached the clearing in under an hour and came out of the trees at a gallop that brought the mare sliding to a stop 10 feet from the porch. Elias came out of the cabin with the rifle before she had dismounted. "There's a manhunter," she said, sliding down from the saddle. "He rode in from Steamboat last night. He has the warrant from Kansas. Garrett Bowles set it in motion. He has men riding with him." Elias looked at her for one moment. A complex series of things moved through his face, none of them panic, some of them resignation, and behind both of those something she caught only for a second before it was replaced by the focused calm of a man assessing a situation. "How long?" he said. "Less than 2 hours, maybe much less." He was quiet. Then he said, "Annie." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't tell me to go back to town," she said. "Don't make a speech about my safety. Don't make decisions for me. I rode up here because there are decisions to be made together, not by you alone." Something moved in his eyes. It was brief and it was fierce, and it was, she was almost certain, the particular feeling of a person who has been handling things alone for so long that being offered otherwise is almost more than they can process. "The warrant," he said. "If I run for the rest of my life. If I stay, I face it. Those are the options. Are there any others?" he thought. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him working through it, the same thorough attention he brought to everything. "There's a lawyer in Denver," he said slowly. "Name of Hargrove. He's handled situations like this before, cases where warrants were issued on flimsy grounds for political purposes. I've known about him for 2 years." He paused. "I never contacted him because contacting a lawyer requires communication and presence, and those things create a trail. How much does it cost?" "I have money," he said, which surprised her and then did not, because a man who spent nothing and owned property might reasonably have accumulated something over 3 years. "That's not the issue." "Then what is the issue?" she said. "The issue," he said, "is that getting to Denver means coming off this mountain, and coming off this mountain means passing through Ember Ridge, and passing through Ember Ridge today means being arrested before I reach the stage." She thought. She thought hard and fast, the way her mind worked when the stakes were real. "There's a stage road 20 miles east," she said. "The Hayden Road. It doesn't go through Ember Ridge." He looked at her. "I know this because I asked Pete Driscoll about stage routes when I was thinking about my own travel options in the fall," she said. "The Hayden Road connects north to Craig and then east. A stage from Craig would reach Denver in 3 days. He stared at her for a moment that stretched. "You are," he said, "a remarkable woman." "I am a practical woman," she said, "which is sometimes the same thing. Now, how long to pack what you need and ride east?" "An hour," he said. "Less." "Then we have time," she said. "Go." He went. She stood in his clearing with the mare and waited and watched the tree line to the south while he moved inside the cabin with the economy of a man who had thought about this scenario before, because a man in his position almost certainly had. He came out with saddlebags and his rifle and a document roll that she guessed was his property papers, and he saddled the large bay gelding from the small corral beside the outbuilding with quick, practiced hands. "Come with me," he said, and it was not a question. She looked at him. "To Denver." "To Denver," he said. "I don't want to leave you here with Bowles knowing you were part of this." She had already thought about this. She looked at the mountain around her and she thought about Della, who was well now and strong enough and who would understand. She thought about Mrs. Prout, who would worry and who would manage. She thought about the livery mare and about Tom Greaves, who had not seen her leave. "All right," she said. They rode east. They went through the trees rather than on the open trail, following a route he knew through the forest that kept them invisible from below. And they came out onto a high meadow that rolled east across the shoulder of the mountain toward the lower country, where the land opened up and the grass was thin and pale gold in the September light. They rode in silence but not in tension, side by side when the terrain allowed it, in single file where it narrowed. And Annie thought that she had spent most of her adult life moving from place to place alone, and that this was different in a way she did not have words for yet. They reached the Hayden Road as the sun was past noon. They made Craig in 2 days, camping overnight in a hollow beside a creek where Elias built a small fire and heated water for tea, and she sat across from him, wrapped in the blanket she had taken from the saddle roll, and thought about how entirely improbable her life had become in the past 6 months, and felt something she identified after a moment as joy, which seemed like an inappropriate response to their current situation, and which she felt anyway. In Craig they were strangers, which was fine. They got rooms at the stage depot, 2 rooms, because there were things that had not yet been said in full and arrangements that had not been made, and Annie was not the kind of woman who did things out of order simply because the situation was dramatic. She was a minister's daughter. Order mattered. On the evening of their first night in Craig, they sat in the depot's small dining room eating the kind of meal that stage depots offered, which was not sophisticated but was hot, and Elias said, "When this is finished." She looked up. "When it's finished," he said, "and I have whatever outcome the lawyer can get me, if it goes well." He stopped. "If it goes well," she prompted. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "I am not asking yet because I don't think I have the right to ask until I can offer you something stable, but I would like you to know that the intention is there." Annie Hart looked at Elias Talbot across a rough table in a stage depot in Craig, Colorado, in September of 1882. She looked at the man who had stepped aside to let her in when everything anyone had told her said he would not. "Ask me now," she said. He looked at her. "Ask me now," she said again. "I don't need stable, I need honest. You are the most honest person I have ever met." She paused. "Ask me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, quietly and without any artifice whatsoever, "Annie Hart, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. The stage to Denver took 3 days, through country that changed from the high plateau into the foothills and finally into the city itself, which in 1882 was a busy, dusty, energetic place that believed very strongly in itself. Denver smelled of coal smoke and cattle and ambition. Annie, who had last been in St. Louis, found it simultaneously familiar and strange. They found a lawyer named James Hargrove, who turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed man of 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles and the focused air of someone who enjoyed difficult problems in the way a craftsman enjoys difficult wood. He listened to Elias' account of the Dodge City incident and the warrant with the expression of a man sorting information into categories. "The warrant is from a Kansas court," Hargrove said. "You are in Colorado territory. Extradition across state lines requires federal involvement, and federal involvement requires someone with enough motivation to pursue it." He looked at his notes. "Who had the warrant revived after 3 years?" Elias told him about Garrett Bowles and about the land and about the suspected silver. Hargrove made notes. "The original complainant in the Kansas case," he said. "Do you know who that was?" "A man named Jonas Rudd, brother of the man who died." "Is Jonas Rudd alive?" "I don't know." Hargrove tapped his pen against his desk. "Here is what I think," he said. "This warrant has languished for 5 years because no one with real motivation was driving it. Someone with local money got it moving again. If we can establish that the revived prosecution is politically motivated, driven by someone with a direct financial interest in removing you from your land, we have grounds for a challenge. Additionally, the circumstances of the original incident, if they were what you describe, constitute a significant defense." "How long?" Elias asked. 3 months, possibly less." Hargrove looked at him. "I will need a retainer." They paid the retainer. While the legal process ground its slow, careful way through the appropriate channels, Annie wrote to Della in Ember Ridge and told her what had happened in careful terms, leaving out the most alarming details but making clear that she and Elias were well and in Denver, and that the situation was being addressed properly. She also, separately, wrote to Mrs. Prout and asked her to keep an eye on Della. Della wrote back. Her letter was 3 pages long, and the first page was pure relief that Annie was safe, and the second page was logistical, and the third page was a detailed series of observations about the nature of love and timing that was so emotionally astute and so entirely Della that Annie laughed until she had to set the letter down. They were married in Denver in October of 1882, in a small ceremony at a church near the boarding house where they were staying, witnessed by James Hargrove and a woman named Mrs. Caldwell who ran the boarding house and had taken an immediate and fierce interest in their situation. Mrs. Caldwell wore her best dress and cried throughout the ceremony and made a cake afterward that was genuinely excellent. Elias Talbot in a clean shirt and his good coat was, Annie thought, the finest thing she had ever seen. He was also, she noticed, frightened in a way she had not seen before, not of the ceremony but of the size of the thing, of the weight of being given something he had not believed he would have. She held his hand through the vows. His grip was very tight. She did not mind. The legal case moved with a speed that Hargrove attributed to a combination of good argument and good luck, specifically the good luck of Jonas Rudd having died of typhoid in 1880, which meant the original complainant was unavailable and the case's foundations were already structurally weakened. Hargrove filed a challenge based on the extradition irregularities and the clear financial motivation of the party who had revived the warrant. And in early December, a federal judge in Denver ruled that the warrant was improperly revived, that the underlying case lacked standing without the original complainant, and that Elias Talbot was not subject to extradition. Hargrove sent a letter to the Routt County Sheriff as a precaution, establishing the ruling on record. They went home. The mountain in December was a different thing from the mountain in any other season. The trail was passable by horse on the day they rode up from Ember Ridge, the sky brittle blue and the snow deep in the shade and thin and crusted in the open, and the pines dark against everything white. Annie had been up this trail 11 times now, and she knew every turn of it, and she rode it differently than she had the first time, without fear, and without the need to demonstrate courage by suppressing fear, simply with the ease of someone going somewhere familiar. Elias was quiet on the ride up in the way he was quiet when he was feeling something large that he had not yet shaped into words. She did not push it. They came out into the clearing, and the cabin was exactly as they had left it, exactly as it had been on that first morning 6 months ago when she had walked toward a leveled rifle and refused to slow down. The snow lay clean around it, and the afternoon light was coming in low and gold through the pines, and it looked, she thought, like a place where something had been waiting to begin. She went up the porch steps and put her hand on the doorframe and looked back at him. "Home," she said. He came up the steps and stood beside her and looked at the clearing and the trees and the valley below, and she watched his face, and what she saw there made her look away to give him the privacy of it. Then they went inside. The winter was something neither of them had words for, and neither of them tried to find words for, because there are experiences that language approaches but does not reach, and a first winter in a mountain cabin with a person you have chosen completely is one of them. The snow came heavy in January and made the world outside small and close, a circle of white and dark trees and the sound of wind, and inside the circle there was firelight and the smell of whatever Elias was cooking and the sound of whatever she was reading aloud, which had become a habit she had discovered he loved with a particular quietness. The way he would sit across from her and go completely still when she read, as though sound itself deserved stillness. She wrote letters to Della and received letters from Della, who had indeed taken the schoolhouse position and who was teaching 23 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and finding it both exhausting and the most satisfying thing she had ever done. Della's letters were long and vivid and made Annie laugh. She also wrote, carefully and without rancor, a letter to Garrett Bowles. She told him that the warrant was dissolved and the matter finished, and that she harbored no personal ill will toward him and wished him no particular harm, and that if he were to approach Elias' land or person again, she would have Hargrove's documentation of his interference presented to the county judge before he had time to stable his horse. She signed it with her full married name, Annie Hart Talbot. She never received a reply. She did not expect one. In the spring, she found a copy of the Routt County Courier that Pete Driscoll had sent up with a supply order, and in it there was a small notice to the effect that Garrett Bowles had sold his saloon and his mining interests and had departed the county for parts unspecified. The notice was written in the careful, neutral language of local journalism, but she read between the lines the simple fact of a man who had run out of leverage and was not interested in staying somewhere he had been beaten. She read the notice to Elias over breakfast. He listened without expression. Then he poured more coffee and said, "Good," and went back to reading the book she had found for him in Denver, a natural history of the Rocky Mountain region that he was going through with the systematic attention he brought to everything he considered worth understanding. Spring was busy. The garden needed expansion, because two people ate more than one, and the growing season at their altitude was short and demanded efficiency. There were repairs to the outbuilding and improvements to the cabin that Elias had been planning all winter, and now executed with the patient precision she had come to recognize as his signature method, doing each thing thoroughly rather than quickly. She began keeping her own records of the plants he knew, a small handwritten compendium that grew over the weeks into something comprehensive, with dried samples pressed between the pages and notes on preparation and application. He read her entries and corrected or added to them, and in this way the document became a collaboration, his knowledge and her organization, and the voice that emerged from the combination of both. She visited Della and Ember Ridge regularly once the trail was clear in April, riding down and back in a long day, and these visits had the quality of two women who know each other completely and have simply been in different places for a while, picking up mid-thought, finishing each other's sentences. Della was well. Della was, in fact, better than she had ever been in Annie's memory, healthy and purposeful and clearly in her own right place. Della came up the mountain for the first time in June, riding up with Mrs. Pruitt, who had declared that she was going to see where Annie lived even if it killed her, and had then done extremely well on the trail, arriving at the clearing with her hat askew and her color high and her eyes bright, pronouncing the view spectacular, and looking at Elias with the direct, measuring gaze of someone evaluating a person who had her approval in theory, and she was now confirming in practice. Elias made tea and offered them chairs on the porch, and was, Annie noticed with considerable private amusement, more careful in his words than he was usually, not stiff exactly but calibrated in the way of a man who understands that he is being evaluated and takes that seriously. "You take good care of her," Mrs. Pruitt said to him at some point during the afternoon in the tone of a woman making a statement rather than asking a question. "I try," Elias said. "She took care of herself first," Mrs. Pruitt said. "You remember that?" "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. And there was something in the way he said it, something that was simultaneously respectful and genuine, and contained within it a complete acknowledgement of the truth of what she'd said, that made Mrs. Pruitt look at him for a long moment and then nod once, which was apparently sufficient. Summer came around again, the second summer, and Annie was watching the meadow below the cabin in the particular way she had developed of watching it, alert to the small changes in grass and wildflower and bird behavior that Elias had taught her to read as signals about weather and season. She was also watching herself, in the interior way, attending to things she had not yet said aloud. She said them one morning in July while they were sitting at the table with coffee, the kind of morning that is so clear and still and perfect that it seems almost constructed for important conversations. "I think I'm going to have a child," she said. Elias looked up from the table. She looked at him steadily. He set down his cup with a care that was not entirely about the cup. "You think," he said, "I am fairly certain," she said. "The signs are consistent. I have been paying attention for 6 weeks." He was very still for a moment. She watched his face go through something that took a while to complete, something that was working its way through whatever old architecture of expectation and self-denial, and carefully maintained limited hope he had built inside himself over the years since Tennessee. Then he got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair so that their faces were level, which was something she had never seen him do before, that particular physical gesture of making himself the same height as another person, and he put both hands on either side of her face and looked at her. His eyes were something she had no word for. "Annie," he said. "Yes," she said. He did not say anything else. He simply held her face in his hands and looked at her. And she let him, because sometimes what is needed is not words but this, the simple act of looking at each other while the understanding of something large settles into the space between two people and becomes part of who they are. The boy was born in April of 1884 in the cabin on the mountain, with a woman from Ember Ridge named Martha Lind who served as midwife, and who rode up the trail 2 weeks before the baby was due and stayed in the outbuilding until the morning he arrived. Elias was present because Annie had told him she needed him there, and because she had long ago learned that telling Elias Talbot directly what she needed was the most reliable way to get it. He was, as she had expected, and as Martha Lind later described to several people in Ember Ridge in tones of some admiration, a steadying presence and completely reliable in a crisis. They named him Samuel James Talbot. Samuel for Elias' grandfather, who had been the first person in his family Elias had ever admired without reservation. James for James Hargrove, who had given them back their future, and who received a letter informing him of the honor and wrote back a reply that was touching in its formality and genuine in its feeling. Samuel was, from the first days of his life, a person of strong opinions and clear preferences, which he expressed with volume and persistence. He was also, even at that age, beautiful in the specific way of babies whose parents are both striking, dark-haired from birth, and with eyes that could not yet decide what color they were going to be. Della came up the mountain when Samuel was 3 weeks old, armed with a bottle of medicinal whiskey she said was for the parents rather than the child, and a collection of baby clothes she had made during the winter in the hours after her students went home, small careful garments in practical wool and cotton. She sat and held Samuel for most of the afternoon and cried twice, and told Annie that he was perfect, and told Elias that she was grateful to him for being the kind of man that Annie deserved, which was a thing Elias received with the characteristic expression of someone who has been handed something they have not yet found the right place to put, but who intends to keep it carefully. The years settled in the way that good years do, not without difficulty or surprise or the ordinary sorrows of living, but with a depth of satisfaction that accumulated quietly. The cabin grew, because Elias added 2 rooms in the winter of Samuel's first year, with the thoroughness of a man building something he intended to stand indefinitely, and these rooms gave them space and gave Samuel his own room when he was old enough to need one. Annie's compendium of mountain plants was copied out in a fair hand and sent to Hargrove in Denver, who passed it to a physician at one of the new hospitals there, who wrote back expressing considerable interest and asking a series of detailed questions. The exchange became a correspondence, and the correspondence led, over the course of 2 years, to a modest publication in a medical journal under the names of Annie Hart Talbot and Elias Talbot, which was the kind of thing that would not have seemed possible from the starting point of any of their individual histories, and which was entirely consistent with who they had become together. Tom Greaves retired the livery stable in 1886 and gave Annie's mare back to her as a gift, maintaining that the mare had always been better suited to the mountain trail anyway, and this was accepted with the seriousness with which meaningful gifts between people who understand each other should be accepted. Mrs. Prout came up the mountain every summer for as long as the ride was manageable, and eventually, when it was no longer manageable, she received visitors from the mountain instead. Annie and Elias, and a rapidly growing Samuel coming down to Ember Ridge for Sunday afternoons in her sitting room, where the same pattern of warmth and good-natured argument and excellent cake had reproduced itself reliably year after year. Della married a man named Dr. Robert Chen in 1887, a physician from San Francisco who had come to practice medicine in Routt County because the need was real, and he had the kind of character that went where the need was. He was the son of Chinese immigrants who had come west during the railroad years and had stayed, and his path to practicing medicine in Colorado had required a persistence and a resilience that Della recognized immediately and entirely. He and Elias had long conversations about medicine and plants and the intersection of different traditions of healing, and these conversations were among the most animated that anyone who knew Elias had ever seen him in, the conversations of two people who have found an unexpected territory of shared passion. Annie and Robert's wife Clara, who came down from Denver to visit, took to each other immediately in the way of women who recognize pragmatic intelligence in each other within the first 10 minutes of meeting. Clara was a seamstress and a reader, and had opinions about everything, which Annie found refreshing, and which Elias found somewhat overwhelming before eventually deciding he liked her very much. Della and Robert had a daughter in 1888, named Grace, who arrived with Della's exact hair and eyes and Robert's calm, considering temperament, and who grew up with Samuel as her closest cousin and eventual partner in the particular kind of organized chaos that children create when given sufficient outdoor space and similar ideas about adventure. Samuel Talbot grew up on the mountain the way children who grow up in particular places grow up, entirely shaped by those places, comfortable in the forest and on the high trails, reading his father's careful patterns in the landscape, and asking his mother questions that she answered fully and without simplification, because she believed that was what children deserved. He grew up knowing his father's hands, the scars on them and the knowledge in them, the way those hands could identify a plant or set a broken bone or carve something from wood or hold his mother's face with a gentleness that was entirely unself-conscious. He also grew up knowing his father's silence, which was different from most silences, being not empty but full, and learning early that a person can be present in a room without filling it with sound, which was a quality he inherited in some measure, and which later in his life, several people who loved him would identify as one of his most remarkable qualities. In the fall of 1889, Annie discovered she was expecting again. She told Elias on a morning that was almost exactly like the morning 7 years earlier when she had told him about Samuel, which she noted, and which seemed to her like the kind of detail that life occasionally produces as if to say, "Look, here is the shape of things." He received this news with the same stillness and the same face doing its complicated internal work, and then the same gesture, the crouching down beside her chair, the hands on either side of her face. "Again," he said. "Again," she agreed. "Are you well?" "Very well." He looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said, which was the word he used for things that were too large to require more words. The second child was a girl born in June of 1890. They named her Clara Margaret Talbot, Clara for Robert Chen's wife because Annie had promised, and Margaret for Elias' mother who had cleaned houses in Tennessee and raised her son as best she could in difficult circumstances, and who deserved, Elias said, to have something good named for her. Clara arrived already with her own strong character, quieter than Samuel had been as an infant, but observant in a way that people noticed even when she was very small, watching the room from whatever position she was in with an expression of serious consideration. Elias sat with her in the evenings that first summer, holding her in the careful way he had always held Samuel, large hands making a kind of cradle, and told her things. Not formal things or educational things, but the kind of things that a person tells someone they are not yet sure can understand. Stories about the mountains and the plants, and what the sky looked like before weather changed. Annie would watch from across the room and feel the weight of what they had built. Not the cabin or the land or even the marriage itself, but the specific life that had been made inside all of those things, which had required all of the specific choices each of them had made to arrive at it. She thought sometimes about the morning she had first walked across the clearing toward a rifle she had tried not to look at, and about what it had taken to keep walking, and about the people in Ember Ridge who had told her not to go up that mountain. She did not regret a single step. In the early months of 1891, Tom Greaves came up the mountain to visit, which he had not done before, and which required, given his age and the state of his knees, a determination that Annie privately found very moving. He came because he wanted to see how things had turned out, he said, and because he was getting old enough to feel that the things worth seeing should be seen while seeing was still possible. He sat on the porch in the spring sun with a cup of pine needle tea, and watched Samuel playing in the clearing below with the three-legged dog they had adopted from a passing trapper the previous winter, and he watched Elias walking the tree line with Clara on his hip, pointing things out to her the way he always did, naming plants and birds and weather, and he watched Annie moving between the porch and the garden with the ease of someone completely at home in the world they have made. "Well," Tom said to no one in particular, in the tone of a man completing an internal calculation. "Well, indeed," Annie said from the garden. He laughed. He had a good laugh, Tom Greaves, the laugh of a man who had seen enough of life to find its outcomes genuinely surprising and genuinely good in roughly equal measure. "I drew you that map," he said. "You did," she said. "Didn't think much would come of it except you getting shot at," he said. "Nobody got shot," she said. "No," he said. "Nobody got shot." He watched Elias and Clara at the tree line for a moment. "He's different," he said, "from what he was." "Yes," Annie said. "So are you," Tom said. For that matter, she thought about this. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived in Ember Ridge, the seamstress with a sick sister and a canvas bag, and the particular determination of someone who has decided that fear does not get to make their decisions for them. She thought about what had accumulated since then, not just the years and the children and the legal resolution and the publication and all the other countable things, but the interior things, the ways in which being known completely by someone who chooses to stay changes the shape of a person from the inside. "Yes," she said again. That evening, after Tom Greaves had made his way back down the trail on the horse that Annie had watched him onto with some care, and after Samuel had been read to and had fallen asleep with his arm around the three-legged dog, who was not supposed to be on the bed and was always on the bed, and after Clara had been settled with the particular combination of singing and specific blanket arrangement she required for sleep, Annie and Elias sat on the porch in the last of the light. The sky over the mountains was doing something extraordinary, the way it sometimes did in the spring, colors layering through the west in gradients from orange to rose to a deep blue that was not yet dark, and the valley below was in shadow and the air smelled of cold coming up from the snowfields above and the warm earth releasing the day below. "Tell me something," Elias said. "What do you want to know?" Annie asked. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking out at the sky, and his profile was the profile she knew better than any other face in the world. The line of his jaw and the forward shape of his nose and the quality of his attention even when what he was attending to was simply the sky. "That first morning," he said, "when you walked across the clearing, what were you thinking?" She considered this. She had thought about that morning many times over the years, had turned it over and examined it from different angles, but she had never tried to put the inside of it into words. "I was thinking about Della," she said. "And I was thinking that I was frightened and that I was not going to let that be the thing that stopped me." "You didn't look frightened," he said. "I know," she said. "I was also thinking that you were very large and that the rifle was not pointed at my head, which I took as a potential sign of goodwill." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, which from Elias Talbot was the equivalent of most people falling off their chair laughing. "And you," she said, "what were you thinking when you stepped aside?" He was quiet for longer. Outside, a nighthawk made its strange, diving sound somewhere in the darkening air above the clearing. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that I had been waiting to step aside for a very long time. I didn't know that until the moment I did it." "But when you didn't stop walking," he paused. "Most people stop. When they see the rifle, when they understand I am not going to receive them, they stop. You didn't." He looked at her. "And something happened in that, in you not stopping. Something that had been held closed for a long time." She looked at him. "I stepped aside," he said, "because you made it possible to. Not because you were brave, or not only because of that, because you were so entirely yourself, so entirely sure of your own reasons." "And I thought," he stopped. "What?" she said. "I thought that whatever was in a person like that," he said, "I wanted it to come in." The dark had fully arrived now, the stars beginning to appear above the mountain, the pine-dark shapes of the trees below the clearing just visible against the lighter dark of the valley. Inside the cabin, the fire had settled to coals, throwing a low, warm light against the windows. Annie took his hand. She thought about all the people who had told her that the mountain man was unapproachable, and about the walk up the trail with her heart loud in her chest and her mind fixed on Della and her feet simply continuing to move, and about the moment when she had seen the doorframe empty itself of his bulk and understood what that meant. She thought about what it is to approach something that the world has collectively decided cannot be approached, and to find that the world was describing something it had never actually tried. "I am glad I kept walking," she said. He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes that she now knew as well as she knew the mountain, all their weather and their depth and their particular quality of being entirely present. "So am I," he said. "Every day." The fire in the cabin burned low and warm behind the glass. The stars over the mountain multiplied in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the sleeping house, their son breathed in slow, deep rhythms of a child completely secure in the world, and their daughter made the small sound she made in sleep that was almost a question, and the mountain held them all in its enormous, indifferent, utterly dependable permanence. Annie Hart Talbot, who had been told the mountain man was unapproachable, and who had approached him anyway, and who had watched him step aside to let her in, sat on the porch of the home they had built together at the top of the world, and was completely, finally, unreservedly home. She did not need any other word for it. Home was exactly what this was.